We will be discussing Cleopatra Jones from the Blaxploitation era of the 1970s. During this time, there's a lot of unrest in the country, dealing with the military and war, and dealing with feminism and also racism. We have seen in the 1970s and previous times student protests and protests against the Vietnam War. During this time, there's again a lot of upheaval. We have urban revolts occurring in Watts in 1965 and other cities around the country such as Detroit and Newark. In total, there are 384 recorded uprisings in 298 cities. During this time, too, we see a shift from assimilationist to a more separatist militant movement, and this is due to decline in the civil rights movement. We see the rise of the black nationalist black power movements, feminism, especially dealing with the open expression of sexuality, Watergate, and the resignation of President Richard Nixon. The 1970s was known as the Me decade. It was a move from social activism to personal gain and ambition. So instead of working towards better collectivities, better communities, we see people working better for the betterment of themselves. Hollywood was also changing and becoming more like what we saw around the nation. We see during this time a rise of black representation in terms of actors, directors, and writers. We also see an increase in films about black issues for black audiences. Again, these films were first called black-oriented films, but later called Blaxploitation. And we see during Blaxploitation films the reemergence of black stereotypes that we saw in the past, as described by Donald Bogle. We see the buck, and the buck is described as being violent, overly sexual, criminal, especially in the various forms of the pimp, outlaw, and rebel. We see they see the degradation of black women as being nothing more than whores. And we see the various forms of the tragic mulatto and coons in blaxploitation movies. Films during this time, again, were more politically focused. They're moving away from assimilation and integrationist messages to separatist, militant messages. In particular, movies were starting to move away from the star of the 60s, so Sidney Poitier and his assimilationist type roles, to more separatist, black person against the man. Hollywood needed black audiences' dollars. Again, the Hollywood industry was near bankrupt and almost collapsed, but blaxploitation films helped keep a Hollywood industry alive. Black-oriented films reflected the life of the ghetto, and it actually glamorized the life of the ghetto. It was a fight against the man and the man's control of black people. Violence was used as a means of self-defense and retribution, and this is also seen with the Black Panthers and other black nationalist movements. The Hollywood film industry, with blacks focused towards black audiences, offered a daydream of triumph. So we see nationwide concentration of poverty in the cities. We see black people not having equal civil rights. We see continuing persecution and discrimination against black people. So these types of films offered a daydream of triumph, that they can overcome all these obstacles. In these films, again, black people refused to make concessions to white audiences. And so instead of, everyone holding hands and getting along like we saw in Sidney Poitier's Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, we see that the black man can be triumphant and defeat the white man's control. Bogle says, what became most disturbing was that while these movies appeared to be black in concept and outlook and feel, and while they were feverishly promoted and advertised as such, they actually were no such thing. Many of the new black-oriented films were written, directed, and produced by whites. Worse, many of the new movies were often shot on shoestring budgets, were badly directed, and were technically poor. The film industry hoped simply to make money by indeed exploiting an audience's needs. Eventually, there was a rise of what came known as the Blaxploitation film, a movie that played on the needs of the black audiences for heroic figures without answering the needs in realistic terms. So Blaxploitation films is what we're going to focus on specifically here. And again, this is a time when black films became profitable and actually helped Hollywood survive financially. They again were directed and written and produced by whites, so it wasn't in some cases considered a white-oriented or black film. It was actually white audience or white directors controlling the images again of black people. Later on, blaxploitation films, because they were so reminiscent of old stereotypes, were actually protested by blacks, particularly the NAACP. Again, blaxploitation films ended, and we were later returned to escapism and old stereotypes of African Americans. In the 1980s, we see an emergence of the interracial buddy film, usually starred by actors like Eddie Murphy. So we're going to intersect race and gender now with women of blaxploitation. And two major women in this type of film, of course, is Pam Grier and then Tamara Dobson. So one of the major themes about black women in these films is that they were superwomen, that they could take care of themselves, they're independent, they can defend themselves physically, they will tear down, break down, beat up whatever they had to, and still stay strong. Again, these types of women in the black film were nothing more than just a feminized version of the buck. And a buck is basically a very over-sexualized and violent caricature of black people. Again, the women in blaxploitation were also seen as a mammy. Instead of taking care of the white man's family, they were a protector and of the community, and they clean up the ghetto. And we see the stereotype of the attractive mulatto coming out, as these women were often portrayed as exotic sex objects, usually for male fantasy. Cleopatra Jones was distributed in 1973. It was written and co-produced by Max Julien, a white man, and Tamara Dobson played Cleopatra Jones, and before she was an actress, she was a fashion model. And what we see in her films and other blaxploitation films is a general idea of good versus bad, where we have the good cops taking care of, or bringing in and killing the pimps of the city and trying to break down the drug cartels in the city. And we see that here with Tamara Dobson as Cleopatra Jones. She is trying to eradicate the drug industry in her community by ending the reign of Mommy, a white lesbian drug lord. Some things to think about while watching these types of films, blaxploitation films, or any kind of film with black women in it of this time, is that we got to think about liberation. What is a liberated black woman? What we see from the feminist movement of this time, it means open expression of sexuality. Is that what we also see for all women, including black women, in film? We see a variety of representation, means seeing images of ourselves what we are familiar with. So that's from Bell Hooks. So when we are happy with our images is when we see more of a variety, that we're not just stuck in these categorical boxes. Does the blaxploitation film and the women in these films have any influence on how black female sexuality is understood and expressed today? Another issue, this is a women-centered film, but could it be also just a representation of male fantasy? Again, this film was produced and directed by white men. Could they really truthfully tell stories of black women? This is from Bell Hooks, From Reel to Reel. It is important to remember that from slavery on, black women have been portrayed in white racist thought as sexually assertive, although the view contrasts sharply with the emphasis on chastity, monogamy, and the male right to initiate sexual contact in black culture, a view held especially among the middle classes. So what does it mean to be a black woman? And who controls these representations? This is about cinema in general and how it reflects society. Cinema can be effectively used to raise consciousness about political concerns. In this case, sexist male objectification of females. So what we can see from Blaxploitation and possibly other genres is that we see sexism and that males control images. In this case, black women's images.